Hello and welcome to episode 322 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. And Ian, are you as tired as I am right now?
As I mentioned before we hit record, A, yes, and B, I don't think it's jet lag. I think it's life lag. I think I did so much more last week than I normally do, or so many different things that my body goes, well, why did you do that?
That checks out. Yeah. At this stage in my life, jet lag doesn't hit me where I'm going. It only hits me when I've returned from where I've been. So I feel like I really haven't slept in a couple days. So that's an interesting change in my jet lag habits that I didn't see coming and really don't care for.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just kind of baking it into the equation now, knowing that when I get home the few days after that's going to be when it really hits me. The adrenaline wears off, I think, is what it is, and then
It's
you're
left
gone.
Gone.
You're left with what you've got. But we both made it home safely from Stockholm. It was so good to see you in person and to
You as well.
To spend time with you in a city that I have come to love over the past decade, and especially to enjoy it for the first time with you when it was nice out for a few days.
Yeah, sunlight and happiness, and birds were chirping. It was, I mean, I never quite saw it get completely dark out. It's not exactly, July or August, but even at like 11, 12 o'clock, I looked out the hotel room window and there was still a glimmer of light on the horizon.
Yeah. So all in all, a good week for those listening to the podcast and thinking, what were you guys doing there? A lot of what Jason was doing there was just kind of hanging out and we recorded the podcast. But what we were doing as a company was getting everything in line for what we're going to be working on over the coming months and into the coming years. And for that, I am very excited. We've got a lot of great things in the pipeline. We were already in the pipeline that became more finalized, and a lot of things that we're now just starting that I think are going to yield some incredible fruit as far as products and features go for those of you that use Flight Radar 24 on a regular basis like Jason and I do. So that's what we were up to, and I'm very excited. But I'm also excited to be home and talk about this week's news. But the one thing I wanted to talk about and kind of kick off the show with was just a bit of travel stuff for those, because I know people listen to the podcast, they often are flying themselves. So a few things that tickled my fancy. And one of those was, Jason, I don't think you'd experienced this before either, but the kind of the new features that they've implemented with the plus grade upgrade system. So for those of you that aren't familiar, if you book into a class of service, economy or premium economy, and you say, yeah, maybe I want to spend a little bit more money or a lot more money in the case of some airlines, I can bid for an upgrade. And SAS is a plus grade airline. And so what you can do is you can say there's a minimum bid, and you can bid the minimum or more and say, this is what I'm willing to pay. And so on my way over, I said, you know what? I could use the sleep because we're going to hit the ground running on Monday and have a long afternoon into the evening. And I thought, I could use the sleep, and it's going to be a long journey because I have to connect to Copenhagen. And I rationalized it into spending some money. And so I bid and I lost. And usually that's the end of it. You're like,
that's
oh,
too
okay.
bad.
You get the email and you're like, oh, bummer. But then I got a notification in the app that says, hey, if you want to bid, here's the minimum, and here's the number you are in line. And that to me was new. And so I said, okay, the new minimum's not much higher than my original bid. So I bid a little bit more. And then I was number one, and I was feeling great about myself. And then I got a notification that said, you've been outbid. And I said, oh no. And it told me that I had gone down to number 3 on the list. But I also knew that there were more than 3 seats available on the aircraft. And so I thought to myself, okay, I'm not going to bid, if I drop down to 7 or 8, then maybe I'll consider it. But at that point I was like, I'm not going to bother with it much more. But I won the bid. And that was very interesting to me because it wasn't like we're only taking the first one. It was a number of available seats, and they let you know what number you are, which I thought was mostly helpful. I think the only thing that would make it more helpful for the customer, and I understand why they don't do this, because they want you to bid more and get up to number one, which the guy who more than me bid quite a bit more than me to be number one on the list. So this is an introduction into dynamic pricing, I guess. But the one thing that would have been nicer if they had said, okay, you're number 3 of, X number of available seats, 6 seats.
Yeah, they're definitely not going to tell you that for reasons you just said. I've never gotten into that level of competition. I guess with Plus Grade, I've always had luck with Plus Grade on SAS, where my offer, the minimum offer, basically,
right,
has always been accepted, thankfully. So I did get that business class seat on the way out there, and I didn't bother bidding on the daytime flight home.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just fine. But there is another company that does something very similar to this that Condor uses. I don't remember their name, but that is purely like a day of or maybe day before flight live auction, very much similar to this Plus Grade thing, which it didn't quite work, or a lot of the reviews for the app you need to download to use it were highly negative, almost kind of calling it a scam, but I didn't really use it. But this Plus Grade implementation seems
this is
quite
all
cool,
within the SAS app. This is all native implementation in the SAS. And SAS hands down wins for most improved online experience.
Yeah, now that they fixed their website so you can actually book a flight.
Part of the reason they do that is that the website actually works now. It didn't for a very long time. For anyone that's used the SAS website in the last 2 years, it just didn't work. It thought you were a bot and would not let you action anything on the website. So they put I think a kind of a hacky implementation on it. It's like a reCAPTCHA, but they have a new beta site that I've been playing around with that is actually good. And their app is just very good now. So glad to see them doing things and making improvements, and the service was good. And it's really, they kind of took heart. I think the huge criticism that they were withering under was that, you're basically a monopoly airline, and it feels like you're not trying. And I think they got the message that, there's competition now in our backyard, and now we actually need to try. I'm very thankful that they're trying. It's benefited me greatly.
Yeah, as I won't say a SkyTeam heavy passenger, but as someone who typically flies Delta more than others, it's nice also to have SAS now in SkyTeam, even if the airline hasn't managed to scrub a proud Star Alliance member logo out of every touch point on board and throughout its experience. That's also a nice change for me.
There's one guy that's walking around with a little Sharpie marker, just crossing stuff out.
It's hard to do stuff like this. It's even little things like the error page on the Wi-Fi captive portal at the very bottom has the Star Alliance logo, a proud Star Alliance member. No, you're not. You're a proud SkyTeam member now, but there are just so many touch points to go over and swap out that some may never make it.
Some just they just exist there for.
That's okay. A memento.
There it is, a memento. The only other thing I wanted to talk about the trip was the interesting conversation I had with one of the pilots on my Copenhagen-Chicago flight. He was actually doing recurrent training on the A330 on that trip, or a check ride on the A330 on that trip. He works for, as well, like on a detachment to the Civil Aviation Authority in Denmark, and does a lot of things there. So he just kind of comes back to make sure he stays current on the A330. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was he flew for Fly Dubai at the height of not necessarily wanting to fly to places like Afghanistan, and operated to places like Bagram and Kabul, and places where I wouldn't want to go at the height of not wanting to go there, and Fly Dubai was still operating there. And so he showed me one of the approach, the AOIs for landing there. And one of the instructions said, if aerodrome is under attack, and then it gave instructions on where to hold, at what altitude, and things like that. So he had some pretty interesting stories. I'm going to connect with him in a little bit, and hopefully we can get him on the podcast.
That's some pretty good advice. If airfield under attack, please hold.
Don't land here.
And wait for attack to end.
that was the week we had. And hopefully listeners can take some nuggets of wisdom out of that as far as options for flights and how to game the plus grade system just a little bit. But now wait, hold on. I take this back. Jason, you have flying news, but not really flying news. Tell me what you did, why I'm jealous of it.
Okay. So a couple months ago, I got a press release from a Swedish company, actually called, I think it's pronounced Candela, advertising their P12 hydrofoil electric flying ferry that just so happened to be operating in Stockholm, which is where we were going. Unfortunately, you were not able to work it into your schedule, but I did on my last day there. And it was, I have some thoughts on this thing. I had never heard of hydrofoil ferry before, which is basically a flying boat by any other means. It basically lowers its engines or propellers, I guess, and some other apparatus into the water, and it actually lifts the hull of the ship out of the water to reduce, I guess, the friction of the water against the boat, and also greatly reduces the wake produced by the ferry to the point where there virtually isn't any. And it's essentially a flying boat, an electric flying boat. The weird thing is, though, that on board, you can't really tell because when you look at it from the outside, you can see that the thing is kind of flying. There's very little part of the ship itself touching the water, but when you're on board, it just feels like a boat, maybe a little smoother of a boat. But I thought that was pretty cool. Unfortunately, about a third of the ride on the route they had it in Stockholm, it just operated as a normal boat going about 8 to 10 miles an hour. But once it did take off, for lack of a better terms, it went about 30 miles an hour, which is pretty cool for a ferry. That's substantially faster than normal. When it converted from just being a ferry to a flying ferry, there was a pause, a bit of a transition where the propellers lowered deeper into the water and you kind of feel like you're taking off. And then when they're ready to slow down, again, it feels like you're landing, as if the acceleration very quickly drops off and the nose of the ship kind of takes a little dive into the water. So that was pretty cool. And I think it's still operating. I don't know for how long, but I know it is still operating in Stockholm a couple times a day. So that's pretty cool.
So the thing here is that it's electric. It is one of the first electric hydrofoil ferries in operation. As we were talking about this, the one thing that I didn't know was that Boeing actually built hydrofoil back in the 70s.
Yes, Boeing had a whole boat thing, back in the day, but those were, I believe, a lot bigger and certainly not electric.
Yeah. These were a lot big, but I was just, we're tying it in somehow.
Yep.
Let's go back to our favorite place, Newark, New Jersey.
That's where I went, and you know what? It was fine.
It was fine.
I hadn't flown in or out of Newark in months. But thankfully, SAS's flight, at least from Stockholm, arrives early enough in the day, departs early enough in the evening that it's typically not affected by the previous daily chaos at Newark. But maybe they fixed it? Maybe.
We'll see over the next couple weeks. The big news today out of the press conference given by DOT Secretary Sean Duffy was that the fiber line that they've been working to complete has been the problem line between New York and Philadelphia, where the controllers are now located. Verizon has laid a new fiber line. They're working on making all of those connections, and then they're going to test it. And so hopefully by the beginning of July, the technological portion of the problems where we were seeing dark scopes and radio failures, hopefully that will all be resolved when this new line comes online.
With the beginning of the end of that solution, since this still isn't a permanent solution of bringing the actual STARS system down to
Correct.
Philly. This is still just rerouting the data that's going through New York down to Philly, just doing that over something that doesn't constantly fail.
Exactly. Let's stay with Newark as we move into a slate of NTSB preliminary and final reports that came out between last week when we were our focus was a bit shifted, and this week. The NTSB has been very busy. So we stay with Newark, and we'll start with the FedEx flight 3609, which was the 767 on March 1st that struck birds on departure from Newark bound for Indianapolis. This was the one that I think we talked about at the time where there was some confusion about whether the aircraft was on fire or not, in which the engine was on fire. Then the crew was getting engine fire indications. The ATC audio said, hey, the ATC that we heard the audio of said, hey, you're not on fire anymore. FedEx said, no, we're pretty sure we're still on fire. And then he said, oh, yeah, you're actually still on fire. So what happened is they hit a bunch of birds. The first officer, who was the pilot flying, saw 3 white birds on the left side and underneath the aircraft, called birds, and heard what they called, quote, an abrupt bang. Airplane began experiencing vibrations, and the first officer began a right turn back towards the airport while the captain declared an emergency. The captain then said the engine indicators soon displayed a right engine damage, including fire indications. They got the fire bell, the warning lights, the fire light, and the right fuel control, and a right engine fire message on the ICAS. So thing lit up like a Christmas tree because, as we know from the video that was available, the engine was in fact on fire. They discharged one of the fire bottles going through the QRH. After the engine was shut down, the aircraft flew more smoothly and the noise level went down. Fire indications were persistent. They discharged the second bottle, but that seemingly did nothing. So after they got back and stopped on the runway, the ARF trucks were able to put out the fire. They then went and evacuated the aircraft. The NTSB, looking at the aircraft after the incident, found, yep, you done hit birds. Bird remnants were visible in both of the engines, and in a link in the show notes, we will put the preliminary report because they put a helpful photo of the number 2 engine, the one that experienced the fire. They didn't lose any total blades, but this was a, I guess, uncontained engine failure situation because enough parts from the front of the engine went out the back of the engine. The NTSB says it doesn't, although it didn't break the fan case. So I guess it's technically not an uncontained engine failure. However, the NTSB says it did not rise to the level of substantial damage, though there was damage in a variety of places on the aircraft and the inside of the engine clearly on fire. Everything was suited, as the NTSB says. So we can take a look at those photos in the link in the show notes. Multiple small impact marks on the horizontal stabilizer, fuselage, and wing control surfaces, consistent with, quote, debris liberated from the number 2 engine.
Love a good debris liberation event. And I believe that was way back on the first day of the runway closure for Newark. So that was a bad day for everyone at Newark. We've come a long way since then.
And right before this flight, a United 777, I think, had just returned to the airport.
Yeah, that'll happen. I feel like that's a daily occurrence, though.
It was like one of those things where it's just like, keep them coming. Let's shift down to San Juan, where we can talk about the Frontier A321neo hard landing and subsequent go-around investigation. So this occurred on the 15th of April in the evening. This is one of those that became the most tracked flight on Flight Radar 24 for a time because there was an incident and then they started closing the airport. And this particular aircraft, November 607 Fox Romeo, was circling for quite some time. So now we know kind of what happened in the preliminary investigation. I'm sure we'll learn much more about why it happened as the NTSB investigation continues. So the NTSB's narrative begins with the first officer as the pilot flying and the captain as the pilot monitoring. The approach was stable, but required a slight lateral correction to maintain centerline while descending through about 150 to 100 feet above ground level for an approach to runway 10. The oral retard alert is, quote, designed to occur at radio altitude of 20 feet on manual landing to advise the flight crew to reduce the thrust levers to idle. The FO called that during the approach and brought back the thrust levels to idle at 20 feet radio altitude while the retard oral alert sounded. The captain recalled that the landing flare began normally but became high at about 15 feet radio altitude. The FO stated that at about 15 feet, the captain noted that the aircraft was too high, so she corrected to a shallow descent and a gradual flare. Then the captain noticed that, quote, the aircraft was, quote, running out of flying speed quickly as the throttles were retarded and the pitch attitude was increasing. So he assumed control, called for a go-around, but by that time, they were low enough that the aircraft did touch down.
Boy, did it ever touch down.
Boy, did it ever touch down. The aircraft touched down on all three landing gears at 2.2 Gs. This is well above the hard landing threshold of 1.8 Gs per Frontier Airlines standard operating procedures. As part of that initial touchdown, the aircraft's left nose landing gear, wheel, and tire separated from the axle assembly and, again, departed the aircraft. This is believed to have impacted other portions of the aircraft, including the left engine, which led to an engine failure.
Did it ingest the
metal fragments
gear,
from the wheel assembly appear to have been ingested by the number one left engine, and damage was found on the engine's inlet cowl liner, thrust reverser, fan blades, and guide vanes. The left inboard trailing edge flaps were also damaged. However, as the NTSB notes again in this incident, the definition of substantial damage was not met.
No, but literally any damage to a fully functional Pratt & Whitney GTF engine is devastating.
Substantial. Oh, that's a good point. That's a very fair point. So the NTSB investigation continues into exactly how this happened, though they do helpfully point in their preliminary report to Airbus's 2021 article titled "A Focus on the Landing Flare," in which Airbus analyzed a few A320 family land incidents which involved landing flare outside of normal procedures. That's another interesting one that we'll certainly keep an eye on and follow up with.
Is that aircraft still on the ground there?
Let's see what we get. This aircraft is still in San Juan. Yes.
Ooh, it's a long time.
It is a long time. I mean, they've got to replace the entire nose landing gear and at least one of the engines, if not much more, depending on how damaged the wing is. So that'll be interesting.
Set an alert for it. Let me know if it ever flies.
Yeah. Alert set. Let's shift gears and talk about a couple of Delta incidents. This one is they're both 717s.
Ooh, and not an aircraft you hear much about these days.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about it twice on this particular episode. So this was a Delta 717 coming into Charlotte, North Carolina. Delta Flight 1092 was about 2,000 feet above ground level when the flight crew lowered the landing gear and observed the nose wheel unsafe condition light illuminated. All of the things that normally happen when that happened. Multiple checklists were applied, attempt to understand by the flight crew whether or not the gear was actually down and locked was undertaken, and then they landed and the nose gear collapsed. Post-accident investigation reveals that the nose landing gear upper lock link failed from a fatigue fracture. So this is not without, I don't want to say without precedent. The potential for this happening was known. A Boeing McDonnell Douglas service bulletin issued in 2001, based on a previously reported upper lock link fracture, laid out all of the requirements for ensuring the continued safe operation of this particular piece of equipment. What's crazy is that we're talking about micrometers. I mean, 3.2 micrometer is, a roughness versus smoothness here. So tiny tolerances. And so this upper lock link was maintained by Israel Aerospace Industries. They did everything they were supposed to do as far as noting that they had serviced it, reinstalled it back onto the aircraft. But the NTSB found that things that were wrong and pitting, consistent with it, what they call environmental attack, which I like, I guess, just for, wear and tear.
That's a very dramatic way of just saying time.
Yeah. And so that was what was happening near the origin of the fracture in the piece. So the NTSB says that, the crack occurred, but contributing to this, they didn't fully comply with the service bulletin when they serviced this piece. That's the final report there. Not a whole lot, but just interesting. I always like bringing up these where it's, something that A, should have been caught, but B, dealing with these minute tolerances.
Across an entire aircraft of minute tolerances. So every little part, every little thing is like this. It's not just this one item. It's just an incredible amount of stuff that's just like this.
Exactly. So then the other Delta 717 report that we have to deal with deals with what is smoke in the cabin, and a lot of it. So as part of this incident, the takeoff roll was happening and smoke began filling the cabin. This particular aircraft this particular flight, the flight attendants just banging on the cockpit door saying, "Hey, let us in," or, "Don't go. This cabin's full of smoke." So then the pilots look down and notice, yeah, the cabin's full of smoke. So they make an immediate return and conduct an evacuation. And they find out, as part of the investigation, the NTSB finds out that there was no oil left in the right engine of this particular aircraft.
Where'd it go?
Into the cabin.
That's not good. I
It got
assume this
burned
is
by the engine into the cabin.
I assume this is an artifact of the bleed air system. That's where the fresh air for the aircraft comes from, or the cabin comes from. And I guess if it infected would be the right word, from the oil from the engine, that's where it's going to end up, which is really problematic. Delta's 717 fleet is not very old. It's not young by any means. Obviously, they don't make the 717 anymore. But it's been a particularly troubled fleet for Delta the past year or two. There are 16 of them grounded, apparently, right now due to all sorts of problems, but primarily the wing spar cracks leading to fuel leaks. And it's just, you don't hear much about the 717, and I can't imagine Delta's too happy with it right now, but they got them cheap years ago from Southwest, so maybe it all works out in the end.
I guess that's one way to look at it.
They're cheap, but the trouble's worth it.
Yeah. I mean, they're cheap enough that the trouble becomes worth it, I suppose. And now we go over to Alaska, where we have a Turbulence, preliminary report on Turbulence, and then a report on the landing gear collapse that occurred. And that's a final report that we'll get to in just a moment. But on December 26, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 700, which was a Boeing 737-9 MAX, encountered severe turbulence during cruise near Las Vegas. The flight crew was aware that there was going to be expected turbulence. The cabin crew was also made aware of that. But as they were flying, the timing of the turbulence became a bit different than what they were expecting. And as the aircraft began to encounter light turbulence, the light turbulence went from not severe to severe. 2 flight attendants were seriously injured. A non-revenue flight attendant passenger sustained a minor injury, and all of them were in the rear galley when the severe turbulence occurred and were not restrained. Everyone who was wearing a seatbelt was uninjured. So
yet another plug for wearing your seatbelt. Well,
yes,
and does much for the crew since they were up doing things.
Right.
But good to hear that no passengers were hurt because they were doing the right thing for a change. Yeah. What a nice surprise.
The one thing that I did want to talk about here, and I thought this was an interesting decision, a wise decision by the crew, is the pilots declared a medical emergency, but elected to continue to Phoenix. after, quote, determining that a diversion to the nearest airport would result in routing through the area of expected turbulence. So that makes sense.
Yeah, you don't want to go through the same troubled air twice just to, divert because you have hurt passengers. That's smart.
Yeah, so I thought that was an interesting tidbit that was worth sharing. And then our final NTSB report of the podcast is the final report into the Alaska Airlines 737-800 main landing gear collapse. This is one that all of the talking heads said, oh, it must have been a hard landing. Those pilots, et cetera, it's Santa Ana, so it's always a tough one to fly. Well, as it turns out,
it just fell off.
Post-accident examination revealed that the aft trunnion pin, and remember, we've mentioned aft trunnion pins before, in the left main landing gear during landing failed due to a fatigue fracture. This next sentence sounds like I'm pitching the Rockwell turbo encabulator.
I'm familiar.
But here we're gonna go with it. So here's the NTSB report. The fracture initiated from a small intergranular region below the external chromium electroplated layer. The fatigue crack, which had propagated to a depth of 0.144 inches, was large enough to cause the remaining material to fracture in tensile or upward bending overstress during landing, resulting in the collapse of the left main landing gear.
No, you read that right off the script of the turbo encapsulator video. That has to be made up.
It's right here.
Okay. Well, we will put a link in the show notes to both the NTSB report and the Rockwell turbo encabulator video.
So good. If you don't know what we're talking about, you're in for a treat, especially if you're nerdy enough to be listening to this podcast. The NTSB finds the probable cause of the accident to be maintenance personnel's excessive grinding of the left main landing gear's aft trunnion pin during machining.
That I understand a lot more.
Imparted heat damage to the base metal and led to the fatigue cracking that caused the pin to fracture during landing. So if anyone's ever sharpened a knife and ruined it, that's what happened. It got too hot and they ruined the part. So interesting, no earth-shattering NTSB reports, but there's always a little something in each of these that catches my eye and I feel is worth sharing. So very kind of varied in our impact today. Let's move on to investigations that are ongoing. The Cessna Citation crash that occurred in San Diego last week, the investigation is still ongoing. Our ADSB data compared for that flight compared to ADSB data from multiple previous flights landing at the same airport using roughly the same type of aircraft and various other aircraft show that the aircraft was on the approach path, within tolerances of previous landings, and then deviated below that approach path, leading to obviously the crash of the aircraft. So what the investigation will look into is definitely A, why that happened, and B, we know that weather was a distinct factor already based on the conditions and based on some of the air traffic control audio. So we're going to hear a lot more about the weather conditions at the time when the NTSB releases its preliminary report in about 3.5 weeks' time, give or take. Jason, let's head to South America, or New York, I guess. I'm not actually
New York,
sure
everyone's favorite location
where
to
they
declare
filed
bankruptcy.
But Azul has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Yeah,
They
feel like a few years later than everyone else in the region, but they finally got
But they
there.
finally done it. So this is due to Azul taking on a ton of debt, as some airlines did during COVID, just to keep things going. And they're declaring bankruptcy now and entering a restructuring process to figure out what to do with about $2 billion in debt. Yeah, that's it. So what they're trying to do is figure out how to emerge with some financing that will be about $950 million as they exit the process. The airline itself is running well, they say, except that they not a huge first quarter, but a first quarter profit nonetheless. following a bad year in 2024, which I guess doesn't necessarily bode well for what's coming in 2025, as most airlines are saying, we don't really know what's going to happen. But being a Brazilian carrier operating Embraer E2s, they are, of course, also impacted by the lack of Pratt & Whitney GTF engines.
Yeah, who isn't? And the release they put out this morning was very interesting. Our friend Ned Russell picked up on this, where Azul said they are looking to their future, reorganizing with key stakeholders, and quote, including its lenders, largest lessor, and strategic partners, United Airlines and American Airlines, to which everyone kind of said, what strategic partnership with American are you talking about? Well, apparently United and American have together pledged somewhere between $200 and $300 million into the restructured Azul, which is super interesting if you're aware of the history of the region with U.S. airlines investing in South American airlines. You had Delta investing heavily in GOL back in the day, and then partnerships with LATAM, Delta taking some LATAM aircraft. So now seeing United and American both investing in Azul, that's a strange one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's, a foothold where you can.
I guess they clearly see potential there, but they're going to see a little less potential than they saw in the past, because apparently Azul plans to reduce its fleet count by about 35%, down to about 170 aircraft by the end of this year. So this is pretty dang quick. That's a big change, a very big change very quickly, but bankruptcy will do that. So they had contractually obligated 842 aircraft this year, but now they will only have 646. So they're going to remove 195 aircraft. That's huge.
I guess we should start an airline.
But it looks like they'll build back up over the years. But yeah, this stuff's never easy.
No, it is not. Speaking of not easy, Boeing has made some design changes to the 777-9 thrust links. We're getting new, beefier thrust links and blanket straps. So Boeing has elaborated on what happened that led to the thrust link fractures on all of the 777-9 test aircraft. So the GE9X engine is attached to the aircraft, attached to the 777X, and the thrust links transfer the thrust that the engine's making into the airframe. And some of these were cracking. So the interior ones were cracking. And they found out that it's because the titanium thrust links were vibrating at a certain frequency or wavelength when the blanket that covers the hydraulic lines within the engine got too close to the thrust links. And there was a high pressure air outlet just there that was blowing air at just it was one of those things where it all came together to create cracks.
And this is why you flight test. Although typically you don't want it to take a decade, but this is exactly why you do flight test. Just not this long.
So Boeing says that when the blanket was too close to the left thrust link, the narrow gap for airflow led to the thrust link vibrating. So they're going to strap the blanket to the nearby hydraulic tubes to make sure that that gap stays wide enough. They are also closing the port that was directing air at the left thrust link, and they're making the thrust links thicker, again with these tiny tolerances, by 0.02 of an inch. And so that'll make it impossible for any of these things to interact with each other in such a way to create vibrations, and that will have solved the problem.
All right, problem solved forever.
Yeah.
You sound so convinced.
Maybe that problem solved forever. This next story, I don't have anything beyond the headline because there's not much to it. I just want to say the words. So Deutsche Aircraft has unveiled its revamped design for the D328 Echo at its facility in Oberpfaffenhofen. Exactly. So what they've done is taken two Dornier 328s, chopped them in half, and then bolted them back together. So the aircraft is basically the front part of one of them and the back part of the other. And they're going to have some Pratt & Whitney engines, and that is going to be the plane. So this is the prototype for the D328 ECO. They will
Okay,
be
then.
powered by the Pratt & Whitney 127XT-S engines, new aerodynamics, upgraded avionics, and engines. So this will be a 40-seat aircraft. I will be very interested to see if this aircraft in its final configuration can be marketed as a replacement for the smaller Dash 8s.
Maybe. Only if you can pronounce the name of the place it's operating in right now.
Oberpfaffenhofen?
There you go. Right outside of Munich.
There you go.
Just call it Munich.
I don't want to call it Munich. This is such a much it's
Rolls
much
right off
better
the
word.
tongue.
All right, fine. So last week we talked about how Lufthansa Group had quietly sunset a rule that they had put into place after the Germanwings crash that said two crew members needed to be in the flight deck at the same time. So if one of the flight crew members needed to go to the toilet, they needed to have another crew in there. So this is interesting. They sunset this, and Jason and I commented on it. And then we got a couple messages from folks who are flying under EASA rules generally, and then flying for, let's call them, large legacy airlines in German-speaking countries. And this was interesting because they brought up what I think is a fairly good point, and kind of takes us into the thinking of why Lufthansa sunset the rule. That the consensus on the security of this was a net threat, because while you have two people on the flight deck at all times, you're also opening the flight deck door more, for longer periods of time. It could possibly increase the risk of unauthorized flight deck access. As a safety measure, it doesn't necessarily improve things. A person not trained to operate the aircraft would do little more than be able to alert someone outside of the flight deck.
I mean, I think that's pretty valuable in itself, no?
So it might improve the reaction time, but might not otherwise bring any benefits. So I think that where they came down on this was, these are kind of they net each other out. So I'm a bit more understanding of the sunsetting of that rule for those airlines. I'm not sure I'm as understanding as some of the feedback that we got of why this isn't, but it does sound like it's a big hassle to deal with. So just wanted to kind of relay that feedback there that we had received. Okay, let's end the show with a couple of news bites. Vietjet has added 20 more A330neos to its order book. So that's 20 on top of the 20 already announced at the Singapore Air Show in 2024. So that's a lot of A330neos coming to Vietjet.
Yeah, big change from, what was it, 2 weeks ago, talking about how Vietjet might be running out of money and running out of time, and now they're running out of orders here. They need
Running out of
more.
places to put their A330neos.
Yeah, that's a lot more aircraft. So I guess its demise was greatly exaggerated for now.
For now. 2XL has signed a contract with Oil Spill Response to deliver two modified 737-800s for additional work, oil spill dispersant. That's great news because it's terrible that oil spills happen, but it's good that there's a way to kind of mitigate that. It's not so great AvGeek news because the current aircraft being used for that purpose are 727s. Those are going to be on their way out when these aircraft come online.
Are there any 7-2's still doing firefighting missions, or?
I don't think so. I think the 7-2 still flying are just doing straight cargo rolls.
Oh,
I
well.
don't think there are any with special purpose at the moment. I would love to be told that I'm wrong. So if you can tell me I'm wrong, email us to podcast@fr24.com. A recap on a story that we talked about a few months ago. This was the company called AOG Technics was selling fraudulent CFM 56 and CF6 engine parts to very serious and large airlines. And they were just giving away fake parts. Well, not giving away, they were selling fake parts. Now, as part of a serious fraud office investigation in the UK, as well as a large investigation in Portugal, they have arrested multiple people, and the director of AOG Technics has been charged with fraudulent trading, and he will be in court on the 2nd of June.
I haven't heard much of this since the story originally broke, but I'd imagine airlines and all sorts of links in the aviation chain are still working to identify all of these fake parts that are surely deeply seated in aircraft and the supply chain at this point.
Yeah. So hopefully they were able to get that done quickly without too much impact. To close out the show, right after we hit stop on the recording last week, and I think this was one of those things where it happened pretty much right after we hit stop, the U.S. accepted the Boeing 747-8 previously used by the Qatari royal family, as a new Air Force jet. So they have officially accepted the jet. We'll see how long it takes for that aircraft to enter service. So this is supposed, it's billed as a quick replacement, but now they're going to have to tear it down and build it back up in its entirety. So
Yeah,
we'll
it'll
see
be
how long
as
that
quick
takes.
a process as taking two other 747-8Is and retrofitting those to be, head of state aircraft. That project turned out to be great.
Ay, ay, ay. So we'll see.
This time, though.
We'll see. Well, we'll see who gets the work officially, and what is actually done to the aircraft to see if they can get it flying faster, which would concern me greatly, whether or not there have been corners cut as far as making these aircraft, because that's what's taken so long, is making these aircraft secure enough for the operation of the President of the United States. So let's make sure that we stay on top of this one, because it'll be interesting to see how they do the modifications on this particular aircraft. Maybe they'll let us do it. Jason, we could do the work. Should we bid for it?
Sure. Fly it on over to JFK, and I'll make sure it gets the treatment it deserves.
Excellent. And on that note, this has been episode 322 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.